When I was in school, our math teacher was a man named Mr. Stigson. He was quite young and the girls in my class thought he was handsome at first. He had piercing blue eyes and always looked like he was in need of a shave. However, from the first day he came to our school, everybody hated him. He had an incredibly violent temper. At the slightest thing, he would fly into an uncontrollable rage, ranting and raving at anyone who had the misfortune to cross his path. He could often be heard screaming and shouting abuse in the corridors and the classrooms. Sometimes he would even physically threaten the students, but he never actually hit anybody. Even so, my entire class was terrified of him. Even the other teachers seemed to be afraid of him and they tried to stay out of his way. One day, a girl named Beverly was late to class. She opened the door just as Mr. Stigson was in the middle of lecturing us. He just snapped and began hurling insults and abuse at her. He got right up in her face and was trying to intimidate her, wagging his finger at her and forcing her to back up against the wall. Beverly was usually a quiet, well-behaved girl, and she didn't deserve the horrible things he was saying about her. He was way too close and invading her personal space. She tried pushing him away, but when she put her hands on him, things got much worse. Stigson suddenly drew back and slapped her across the face. We were all completely shocked. Even Beverly couldn't believe what he just done. She stood there dumbfounded for a few moments. She ran out the classroom sobbing and clutching her cheek. Stigson continued teaching as if nothing had happened. The classroom was completely silent. The tension in the room was palpable. You could have heard a pin drop. We all knew that Mr. Stigson was going to be in big trouble. The next day, Beverly's mother showed up during class and demanded to speak to Mr. Stigson. He went outside to talk in the corridor and closed the door behind him. The whole class stayed silent, trying to eavesdrop on their conversation. Beverly's mom started screaming at the math teacher, cursing him out and calling him all the names in the book. She said she was going to get him fired for assaulting her daughter. When we peeked out the window, we saw that Stigson was just standing there in front of her, not moving a muscle. There was a furious scowl on his face, but no matter what she said, he didn't react. It was quite unnerving. When Beverly's mother finally stopped shouting, she stormed off and Stigson came back into the classroom. His face was bright red and there was a boiling rage in his eyes. Ignoring us, he sat down at his desk and just went through his papers until the bell rang at the end of the class. The next morning, when I got to school, I heard the shocking news. When Beverly and her mother had been driving home the day before, they had been involved in an accident. The car crashed into a phone pole. The mother was killed on impact and Beverly was in a coma. I was horrified. Some of my classmates were crying. Others just sat at their desks in stunned silence. Everyone was devastated. Everyone, that is, except Mr. Stigson. He spent the entire day with a huge grin on his face. I had never seen him so happy. It was as if he was delighted by their misfortune. I never imagined the truth. A few weeks passed and gradually everything went back to normal. One day during math class, a cell phone went off. Mr. Stigson went crazy and started running around the classroom, demanding to know whose phone was ringing. When he eventually found the source, he grabbed a boy named Jared by the throat and pulled him out of his seat. He dug through Jared's pockets until he found the cell phone and confiscated it. After class, when Jared went up to get his phone back, Stigson refused to give it to him. Instead, he locked it in his briefcase. Jared was furious and, as we walked home together, I came up a plan. The next day, when class was ending, I distracted Mr. Stigson by asking stupid questions about a simple math problem while Jared went through the unattended briefcase and stole his phone back. We thought we had pulled a fast one, but After school, as we were walking home, I got the feeling that we were being followed. I turned around and was shocked to see Mr. Stickson's truck slowly cruising along the street behind us. He was sitting in the driver's seat, staring at us with his cold, blue eyes. Before I could say anything to Jared, Stickson's truck suddenly stopped dead in the middle of the street. I looked to my right, just in time to see a speeding car hurtling past the intersection. It ran straight through the traffic lights and came barreling towards us. "Look out!" I screamed and dived for safety, but I was too late to save Jared. Car smashed into him, throwing his body into the air. It was horrible. I lay on the ground, dazed and confused. When I looked around, I saw Jared's broken and bloodied body lying in the middle of the road. He wasn't moving. Stickson's car was nowhere to be seen. An ambulance showed up a few minutes later and took Jared to the hospital. But there was nothing the doctors could do for him. An hour later, he was dead. It was a few days before I felt well enough to return to school. Witnessing the accident was incredibly traumatic. In math class, Stigson glared at me, never saying a word. He never mentioned anything about the accident or Jared's death. However, he did have a sly smile on his face. One evening, I got a call from Beverly, which really surprised me. She was still in the hospital, recovering from her injuries, but she had come out of a coma and was well enough to speak on the phone. She said that she had heard about Jared's accident and asked me if I had been with him when it happened. I told her that I was with him, and I told her that Stickson had been there as well. "I knew it," she cried. Just before my mother swerved off the road and hit the telephone pole, I saw something. I looked out the window and saw a truck in the lane next to us. Mr. Stickson was in the driver's seat. The rest is just a blur, but I remember him clearly. He was just staring at us. Basically, she said Stickson had somehow caused the accident. I didn't know what to think. It all sounded so crazy. But if Stickson was at the scene of both accident, he had to be involved somehow. It was too much of a coincidence. Beverly told me to watch out for Stickson. She said he was dangerous and I could wind up being his next victim. I didn't know what to think. The next morning when I left for school, there was a pickup truck parked at the end of the street. It was Stickson's truck. I couldn't see the driver, and as I approached, this truck's engine started up and it roared off into the street. It was enough to freak me out. I became a nervous wreck. At night, I would look out the window and see Stickson's truck parked outside my house. Sometimes he would allow me to see him, sitting in the driver's seat, staring at me with those cold blue eyes. He was trying to intimidate me. After a while, it became obvious that there was something wrong with me. I lost my appetite and seldom made a thing. I began to lose a lot of weight. I rarely managed to get any sleep, and when I did, my dreams were plagued by thoughts of Stickson. My parents assumed I was struggling in school, and eventually Mr. Hawthorne, my science teacher, stopped me in the hallway and told me he wanted to see me in his office. "Is there anything you need to tell me about?" he asked. "Something you need to get off your chest? Something involving Mr. Stickson, perhaps?" My jaw dropped. I just nodded. Everything came pouring out. I told him about my suspicions that Mr. Stickson was involved in the accidents. When I finished, Mr. Hawthorne had an odd look on his face. I sat there expecting him to call me crazy and throw me out of his office. Instead, he patted me on the shoulder and told me that he had believed me. He said that a few years ago, he and Mr. Stickson had been teaching at another school. He also revealed that there had been a couple of very strange accidents at the school during the time Mr. Stickson had been teaching there. Initially, there were problems with the vandalism. A few students broke into the classrooms and spray-painted graffiti on the walls. They also broke into the teachers' desks and stole some equipment. The last classroom that had been broken into was Mr. Stickson's. The next day, 3 students had been killed in a horrific car crash. Some of the items that have been stolen from the teachers were found in the trunk of the car, and there was a can of spray paint lying in the back seat. It was obvious that they'd been the ones who vandalized the school. Everyone at the school was horrified, all except Stixon. Mr. Hawthorne grew suspicious when he saw how happy and pleased Stixon became when he learned about the accident. Some time later, the school had to let several teachers go. Mr. Hawthorne and Mr. Stixon lost their jobs. The next day, the school administrator who made the cuts was hit by a car. He later died in the hospital. Mr. Hawthorne said that when he left the building, he saw Stixon standing in the doorway, just staring at administrator. He described the same cold, seething glare I had seen. He told me that he had been keeping an eye on Stixon ever since. I was astonished and didn't know what to say. I told Mr. Hawthorne that we had to do something. If Stixon was responsible for the accidents, we had to stop him. We had to contact the police. Hawthorne shook his head gravely. "There's no proof," he said. "Stixon can't be tied to anything. Even if the police believed us, they could never make a case. No jury would convict him." "Then there's nothing we can do," I said hopelessly. "Don't worry about it," said Mr. Hawthorne. "Let me take care of it." That evening I was walking home from school when I got the strangest feeling that I was being watched. The hair on my back and my neck stood on end. I looked around and saw Mr. Stixon's pickup truck. It was parked on the other side of the street and he was standing right in front of it. A chill ran down my spine. His face was twisted in rage and he was staring at me intently, his eyes cold and filled with malice. The next thing I knew, I felt a squeezing sensation around my neck. He was choking me. I couldn't breathe. My lungs were fighting for air. I was terrified and started clutching at my throat. I was beginning to black out. Then I heard a terrible sound. It was a deafening screech, followed by the crunch of metal on metal. The squeezing sensation around my neck stopped and I could breathe again. When I finally managed to sit up, I saw what had happened. A car had crashed straight into the pickup sticks and was crushed between the two vehicles. His top half of his mangled body was lying across the hood of the car in a pool of blood. He was dead. His corpse had been so crushed that his guts were forced out through his mouth. It was a sickening sight to behold. The car door opened and a figure stumbled out. He had survived the crash, but he was badly injured. He fell to his knees in the middle of the street. I ran over to help when I saw his face. I stopped in my tracks. It was Mr. Hawthorne. Many years ago, a small village in Germany was held in the grip of terror. It began when a number of farmers in the area started complaining that a wild beast was preying on their livestock. None of them knew what kind of animal it was. Nobody had ever managed to lay eyes on the mysterious beast. It seemed to strike with devastating savagery, then vanish into the night as quickly as it had appeared. It never left any tracks behind. One morning, at the break of dawn, a farmer went out to check on his sheep and found a horrifying scene. In the middle of his field, there was a bloody mess of raw meat and white wool. 3 of his sheep had been disemboweled and partially devoured during the night. A few days later, another farmer awoke to find 2 of his best sheepdogs had been killed. They lay dead at his back doorstep, their stomachs ripped open and their internal organs torn out. As time went on, more and more horses and cattle were found dead, mauled and eaten in exactly the same way. The elusive beast seemed to have a hunger that was insatiable. Soon everyone in the village had heard about the grisly fate the animals had suffered. Not one person could identify the type of beast that made the killing so horrific. The farmers began to worry that their entire herds could be wiped out. Then the unthinkable happened. A human being was brutally murdered. It was on the night of a full moon that the town drunk Thorsten Boer was last seen leaving the local pub and staggering home along a dark country road. In the morning, his mauled remains were found lying in a ditch by the side of the road. His body had been torn to pieces and his severed head was impaled on the rusty iron gate. When news of the killing spread throughout the village, the people were thrown into hysteria. The villagers were terrified. Now that the beast had a taste for humans, nobody was safe. Most people were afraid to set foot out of doors after sundown. Farmers made sure they kept all of their livestock locked safely in their barns. Men and women alike began to arm themselves with whatever weapon they could find. Families locked their door and bolted their windows at night. Mothers went to bed with a knife under their pillows and fathers slept with shotguns within easy reach. During the day, the talk throughout the village was focused on only one topic: the wild beast. People put forth all kinds of wild theories and speculations. There were some who believed that the killing had not been committed by an animal at all, but a human being. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion and nobody trusted anybody else. Then sadly, several of the villagers just ended up missing without a trace. The men in the village decided that something had to be done, so they banded together to form a mob. They didn't know what they were fighting, which made things even worse. They also lacked a leader, which made them an unruly mob. Unfortunately, it seemed as if they were unable to organize themselves enough to take action. There were two brothers named Wolfgang and Dieter Hoffmann, who lived on the outskirts of the village near the forest. It had been their cattle who were slaughtered by the beast. Fed up with the inaction of other men, the two brothers went home to discuss doing something themselves. That evening they sat around their kitchen table, trying to come up with ideas. Their old grandmother sat by the fireplace in a wheelchair, her black shawl wrapped around her. "We have to do something, and we have to do it tonight," said Wolfgang. "If we delay any longer, the beast will just claim more lives." "You're right," his brother agreed. "Whatever this thing is, man, or beast, it strikes only during a full moon. Tonight, the full moon will be once again. We can't underestimate what we're dealing with," said Dieter. "This vile thing attacks without warning. It stalks the forests like a ghost. Hunting this beast will be extremely dangerous. We'll need all the luck in the world if we're to come back alive." Wolfgang looked over their old grandmother who was still sitting by the fireplace. "Will you wish us luck, Oma?" he said. The old woman didn't even look up. She had been senile for years. The two men went back to their conversation. Wolfgang began to outline his plan. "We will both take our shotguns to the outskirts of the forest tonight. We'll set ourselves up on the path between the forest and the village. If the monster comes out tonight, it will have to pass by one of us." "And what protection will we have?" asked Deirdre worriedly. "Each other," Wolfgang answered. "We'll stay within shouting distance of each other, and we'll keep our backs to the village so that we face the forest and the wild beast." "It's a dangerous job, but someone has to do it," Deirdre said. "We don't know who the next victim will be. We can't just sit back and let the monstrous thing kill us off one by one." They stood up and grabbed their shotguns. Wolfgang pulled a long, sharp machete from the wall. As they were about to leave, Deirdre stopped at the door. "Don't worry about us, Oma," he said. "We'll come back to you alive." Outside, the night was pitch black and silent. The full moon hung low in the western sky. They set out walking towards the forest. As they drew near to where they had planned to station themselves, Deirdre whispered, "I wonder what it looks like." "I've been thinking about that myself," Wolfgang said. "Whatever it is, we're gonna find out. Just pray it doesn't attack you from behind." Just then they heard something moving quietly through the undergrowth. Both brothers felt their skin crawl and the hair on their backs so their necks stood on end. Slowly, they both turned and looked behind them. There was nothing but trees and shadows. For several minutes, they stood together like that in the dark, each one paralyzed by his own horrible thoughts. Then Wolfgang held up his hand and indicated to his brother that they should take their positions. The two brothers moved off in opposite directions. They couldn't see each other in the darkness, but they remained within shouting distance. Standing in the dark, Wolfgang carefully cocked his gun. Then he took the machete and stuck it in the soft ground by his feet. He waited. Not far away, Deirdre fumbled nervously with his gun. He felt his hands shaking and sweat was pouring off his forehead. He wished he could see Wolfgang, but his brother was obscured by the dark shadows of bushes and trees. Deirdre turned around to look toward the village and wished he was safe inside his cabin. Then he heard the cracking of a twig behind him. He spun around, and before he had a chance to react, he felt 10 sharp claws digging into his neck. Wolfgang heard his brother's terrified scream echoing through the forest. He grabbed his gun and his machete and followed the awful cries. His brother was in trouble, and he had to save him or die trying. As he drew closer, Wolfgang strained his eyes but couldn't see anything in the darkness. But then he heard Deirdre's voice choking desperately. "Wolfgang, it's... Wolfgang raised his shotgun and fired into the darkness. The next morning, when the two brothers failed to return, the other villagers went out looking for them. Searching the area, the man came across the 2 dismembered bodies lying on the ground next to each other in a pool of blood. They fetched some sacks and filled them with body parts. Then they carried Wolfgang and Deirdre's pitiful remains back to the village. When they reached the brothers' cabin and began transferring the body parts into the coffins, no one ever noticed that their grandmother wasn't there. They all thought the old woman was senile and paid no attention to her. None of them noticed that she was gone from her spot by the fireplace, and no one noticed when she slipped silently in through the back door and sat down there again. From her wheelchair, the old woman looked over at the bloody remains of Wolfgang and Deirdre. No one saw the evil smile that spread across her wrinkled face, and no one saw the clawed hands she hid under her back shawl.